I'll give you two examples of events that had an impact on me in terms of my passion for Kappa Psi. The first, I came to pharmacy school as a transfer student. So my first year at Ole Miss, I was in the first year of the pharmacy curriculum. And I pledged Sigma Nu Social Fraternity about a week before school started. So I was already involved in the social end. And about a month or two later, Kappa Psi had a rush smoker, they called them back then. And it, in essence, was a banquet. And the people came in coat and tie. And I remember the head table. When I looked at the head table, I saw the dean of the School of Pharmacy. I saw the previous dean of the School of Pharmacy, the dean of the graduate school, Dr. Dodge, that was a long time Grand Council deputy. In fact, all of the faculty members in the School of Pharmacy, but two were Kappa Psi brothers. So I was really impressed with both the formality and the people that were there. And the brothers, there were about 8 or 10, they were all seniors. The chapter was fairly small. And that made a big impression upon me immediately, that Kappa Psi is where I wanted to be. And then the next spring I was initiated in Kappa Psi in the spring of 1962. I was elected as the Regent of the chapter. That's the only office I ever held as a collegiate, was Regent. And some 3 months after I was elected Regent, I met my first national officer, Herman Forsland, who was Grand Regent, came all the way to Mississippi from Oregon for a chapter visitation. And needless to say, I was quite nervous about that, but between the deans and the people that were Kappa Psi brothers here, it was really a meaningful experience for me. Then when I graduated from pharmacy school, I practiced pharmacy for between 2 and 3 years before I ever came back to graduate school. So I really wasn't involved with the fraternity at all while I was out. When I came back to graduate school, I became involved again with Beta Rho from 1966 to 1970. And then in 1970, I got my PhD in August 1970 and joined the faculty at the University of Houston. And it was at Houston that I became involved with Delta Delta chapter. Although I was not the GCD, I simply went to their meetings and their parties. And then in the fall of 1971, I came back on the faculty at Ole Miss. And some 3 or 4 months later, I was elected as the Grand Council deputy. And then the second event, getting a long way to the second event that really had an impact on me and my passion for Kappa Psi. I went to the Grand Council Convention in August of 1972 in New Orleans. Keep in mind that I had never been to a province meeting, never been to a national convention, held one office in the fraternity. And so when I got to New Orleans, I met 15 or 20 people that we became really very close for life. There were people like Norm Campbell and Bill Fitzpatrick, Don Floridia, I hate to leave people out, Paul Hiller, Leonard Nager, all of these people, I didn't realize it at the time, but 40 years later, we still are very close. And certainly that convention had a big impact upon my passion for Kappa Psi. Okay, again, it makes me nervous to mention people because I leave out some that really ought to be on that list too, but I would certainly start with Frank Eby and Nick Finney. 2 of the 8 people I included in the history book as the legends of Kappa Psi. They were the only 2 that I ever met personally. I had the opportunity to communicate over the phone with writing, and also I visited in both of their homes. I'd also mention Bob McGarren and Tony Palmieri because they were the two people that I helped the executive committee recruit and hire as the executive director and the editor of the Mask back in 1980. From my province, I would certainly mention Bill Fitzpatrick and Johnny Porter, Pat Wells, Charlie Carden, Leonard Nager, Paul Knick, Lynette Wheel, who was one of the first female supervisors, or not supervisor, but satraps in the province. I'd also mention people like Paul Hiller, Jack Atkinson, Frank Fascione, really all of the Grand Regents. I had the opportunity at least to meet on one or more occasions all of the Grand Regents since 1946, except for two. I never had the opportunity to meet James Thayer, dean of St. Louis College of Pharmacy. He died in a fire. And then I never met Walter Williams, who also died while he was in office. But all of the other Grand Regents knew really well up until maybe the last 3 or 4. I don't know as well, but anyway, that's some of the people. There's so many, and I've certainly left some out, including some of them here at Ole Miss in my own chapter of Beta Rho. Mm-hmm. I mentioned Frank Eby initially. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the reasons I felt that it would be good for you to come over to our home and conduct this interview is because I still remember visiting the home with Dorothy and Frank Eby. Mm-hmm. I flew to Philadelphia and caught the subway and went out to their house and visited with them. And then later on, really about 10 years later, when I was working on the history book, had the opportunity to go and visit in the home of Nick and Ann Finney. That was Nick's second wife. Both of them are named Ann, but the second one was never involved in the time, all of the years that he was so involved at the executive committee level of Kappa Psi. But I have really fond memories of going and being in each of their homes and spending a couple of nights with Nick, and he took me around to some of the early years when I was working on the early history of the fraternity. We went to New Haven and we went out to Cheshire, and he actually went to Hillhouse High School, where the fraternity really began with Russell and Hillhouse in Cheshire. He was a student there. In fact, there was a guy that was the dean at Connecticut. Trying to remember his name. We went by and visited him at a nursing home there. He was really a New Haven historian, but he was the former dean of the school of Connecticut, and he had actually taught the Russell Military Academy. He actually taught Russell's granddaughter in school. And I guess other brothers there, I guess 3 or 4 in particular, they're no longer with us, that meant an awful lot to me in my life. Leonard Nager, Craig Johnston, Paul Hiller. Paul Hiller took me to Cooperstown, which was always on my bucket list. I'd love to go when I was 12 years old, but I had a great time going there. And Craig Johnston, I always remember Craig. He's the only person I ever knew of that was elected as the province satrap before he ever attended the province assembly. I was a supervisor up in Province 10, I guess, which was primarily Washington and our new chapter in Canada. Montana, the chapter there hadn't even been reactivated yet. But he gave me this big suite up at the Lake Coeur d'Alene or something like that, and I was thinking, well, I didn't spend 3 hours there the whole time, and course, he didn't know how to handle a program. I said, well, Craig, we need to have a little bit of substance in this program, so we did a history presentation for it. But that's the first time I ever met Craig, and he was getting ready to leave Washington State, and he was either going to Idaho or he was going to Montana. And I said, well, one of those two places, a couple of years from now, we'll have a Kappa Psi chapter going. And he wound up going to Montana, and about 2 years later, not only was it reactivated, but they actually got chapter of the year not too long after that. I've always said that the most important people in the fraternity really is not the members of the executive committee, but it's the Grand Council deputies in the chapters. And I could name you 5 or 6 that, you know, truly outstanding GCDs. Craig Johnson certainly in that group, because if you show me a chapter that's been consistently good, then I'll show you a chapter that's got a really good Grand Council deputy. And back when I was Grand Regent, I tried to put together an article in the Mask on some of the top GCDs. When you do that, you're going to miss some you don't know at all. But there, you know, there were a handful of people that just stood out to me, like Frank Fascion at Mu Omicron Pi in Detroit. I was just amazed how they followed Frank. In fact, even in the province assembly, they would meet for 3 days. They'd start on Thursday and go through Saturday, and they were in coat and tie almost the whole time. It's just a completely different experience. Ken Kirk, that was dean at the St. Louis College of Pharmacy. Before that, he was associate dean at Texas, and where I first met him was up at Purdue. He asked me to come up and speak at their initiation banquet, and I was impressed in that maybe they had 25 people, and he introduced every one of them, had stories to talk about each one. I realized he really did such a good job. More recently, Gary Van Riper. I've known Gary a long time. And if anything, he gets stronger with the years. And of course, he even got much more involved at the national level after he'd been there a long time. And then David Mays, that's down at San Antonio. I first met him. He was the GCD at the chapter that we formed at Wilkes-Barre. I actually went up with Bob at that installation ceremony, and I was really impressed with how well he organized things. And I realized when he went to San Antonio, the same thing happened. But there are a lot of other good ones. But to me, those are the most important people in the fraternity, because really the strength of our fraternity is our collegiate chapters. And the GCD is the only person that really has longevity in terms of being there. You know, one obviously I hadn't talked about that I certainly need to, and that's William R. Smith. I got to know William, I guess, the first time in New Orleans. He was another one that had been to 2 or 3 Grand Councils before I ever went to them. And he was always such a dedicated Kappa Psi brother. I remember he had a fondness for trains. And if we saw a train, and I knew I was going to be there for a while, because he'd tell me everything in the world about the trains. And I can remember when William R. was Grand Regent, he was looking for a location at the Grand Council Convention. He wanted to be at the Grand Targhee Resort, which was in Wyoming. He thought it really had to just be great because it was on the western side of the mountain, and you went up and it was totally isolated, and he felt that it would really develop the brotherhood because of there was nothing there but them. And so I went out there, and we actually went across the mountain from Jackson Hole and then up the western side and spent the night there. And in the end, it turned out that somebody burned down the main building there because they thought it was getting too commercial up there, and we were concerned about whether or not we were going to have to be in a tent for the closing banquet. And I remember somebody told me, Dewey said, if you wind up there Mary Campbell may not think too much of this. We're out there in the tent. But anyway, since it didn't work, when we went back down Jackson Hole, they had one place, the Snow King Resort. It was the only place in town that really could hold the people, and luckily we were able to get in there at that time. I don't think it come close to holding the number of people we had today. But I remember going up with William on that. I remember he helped me immensely when I became Grand Regent in 1979. We held the first Grand Council Convention after that in Detroit. And at that time, we weren't doing that well financially. And William and Frank and the brothers of U Omicron Pi, they would have a bingo night every Friday night, and they'd get together about 6 and they'd last till midnight, and they'd eat pizza and drink beer after they had the bingo deal. But the bottom line was they were raising $2,000 a week, and they wound up generating about $75,000 over that year, and they put a lot of their money into the convention itself. And then they also turned around really what amounted to 10% of that money, $7,500, and gave it to the fraternity, which at the time was very helpful. Mm-hmm. But there's nobody that was more of a committed brother than William R. Paul Hiller, I was very close to Paul Hiller. Going back to New Orleans, it was Paul and Larry Oshesky and a guy named Ted Stuka. They called him Bernie Bambini. I remember those three guys. They drove down from Temple. They were collegiate members, and boy, they had the energy. I remember we were at the Kenner Inn, which was a Hilton out by the airport. It really was kind of run down, to tell you the truth, but we were 30 minutes from downtown. We weren't down around Bourbon Street, but I remember one night being down there 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I said to myself, I don't know whether these three guys are going to live to be 30 years old or not. And then later on, Hiller winds up Grand Regent. But he stayed with me 2 or 3 times when we would have, it's APHA or what have you. And we got to know each other over the time. Of course, he and Bob became real good friends too. And Paul liked to stay up most of the night and chatting in the bars, so I let Bob do most of that, and I went to bed. But he's one. Of course, Lenny Nager. Lenny was a wonderful guy. Everybody liked him. He was a very good speaker. He was on the faculty of St. Louis College of Pharmacy, but actually he was teaching as much over there in the nursing school and medical school and doing these cruise talks all around the world later on. But he had the personality that the brothers really enjoyed being around him. And of course, with Gamma Pi in St. Louis, I mean, he was a leader. Again, if I go back to that early time when we didn't have much money, we decided we'd hold the reception at the APHA convention over at the Gamma Pi house. Then he said, why don't you come over here? It won't cost us much money, and we did. And I always remembered the house. There was so much noise in that basement, 3 floors up, you could barely hear yourself think. And again, I could remember, I think it was Bob McGarren told me, you need to take Norm and Mary back to the to the hotel. I mean, it was pretty rowdy, but we certainly saved the money and had a great time. But now, Leonard, I remember he was Grand Historian for many years, and he never really thought that he really wanted to move up to Grand Regent. He's probably the only guy I ever remembered that said, well, look, I'm not going to run for a national office anymore because I'd like to see somebody move into this spot that can move up later to Grand Regent. Those people, Milton Neuroth, who was the Grand Regent before I was ever in too, back in the 50s, I guess, at Virginia. I remember him because the only graduate chapter that I installed in the 4 years that I was Grand Regent was the Virginia graduate chapter. You think about the proliferation of graduate chapters today, literally over a 4-year period. The only chapter was Virginia graduate chapter. And I remembered the wit that he had about him. When we went there to Richmond, it snowed about 8 or 10 inches at night, so a lot of people around the area didn't even get there for the installation. But I remember he and Ed Simnewski and Tommy Thompson were three of the people who were very instrumental in getting that chapter going. Okay, probably some others if you call their names, but those certainly stand out. Norm, I guess I should mention Norm because, I mean, he's obviously still living, and he became Grand Regent when I went to New Orleans in 1972. And I was nominated for third Grand Vice Regent, and I didn't get elected. Like I said, I told you earlier, I only knew one person that was there, I think, totally, out of the whole group. But anyway, I forget who was elected as the third Grand Vice Regent at the time. It may have been Bill Fitzpatrick, I kind of believe it was. But anyway, Norm was elected Grand Regent. I remember he had the honor of getting thrown in the pool after the election. But I guess a month, 2 months after the convention, Norm called me. He wanted to appoint me as a graduate member on the executive committee. And that really was when it got started. You know, I talked to you earlier about the sparsity of people that are on the ballot for national office. I think it really helps people to run, because there I got visibility as third Grand Vice Regent candidate, and later Norm knew who it was, and appointed me to the executive committee. And I didn't know it at the time, but that was the first of 17 consecutive years that I wound up on the executive committee. But Campbell has, of course, he and I are colleagues in Pharm Ad too, and of course he has a law degree as well. But Norm has, you know, been involved in fraternity really longer than anybody else, I guess, now that's still living. As I mentioned to you earlier, he had about a 10-year start on me, although he's only about 2 years older than I am. He had been to 3 Grand Councils before I ever made my first. But he's always there, and with the foundation and everything, he's been a tremendous contributor to our fraternity. You know, I told the leadership in our chapter years ago, I said, it's all right for us to stay all male if you want to. And we're getting along with the KEs, and we had the little sister and the big brother program. Anyway, we had the little sister and the big brother program, and I told him, I said, but now if we get down to less than 20 members, we need to consider going co-ed. And in the end, they really didn't do that. We almost became extinct before they decided to go co-ed. But, you know, I mentioned William R. Smith earlier. I went over to a province meeting, and it was Province 4 back then at Auburn. And William R. saw these group composites on the wall. They had the KEs and the Kappa Psi's. And we looked at them, and really they were the same people in both pictures. William got all excited about it. He said, well, you know, if you can't be a member of another professional fraternity if you're in Kappa Psi. Well, it turned out that KEs had their big brothers in their pictures, and Kappa Psi had their little sisters in theirs, so really it was the same people in the two pictures. But you know, today, I guess 80% of our chapters, at least, maybe more, are co-ed. In fact, I don't think you had a question on here to talk about it, but one of the things that I realized when I was working on the history book and up to today, we have had 3 periods of time in our history that we had a tremendous increase in membership and chapters. The first time was right after World War II, 1946-47. We had people coming back from the military service in droves, enrolling in pharmacy school on the GI Bill, and that's one reason why Frank Eby and Nick Finney, they installed so many chapters and they reactivated so many chapters, because suddenly we had all of these people coming into schools. And then the second biggest growth period we had began in 1977 or 78 when we went co-ed. Our first two co-ed chapters was the chapter at Duquesne and the chapter in San Francisco. Both of them initiated in the spring of 77 or 78. But suddenly, the pharmacy schools were becoming more and more women. I mean, 50 to 75% of the students were women. And then when we went co-ed, I mean, our enrollment membership went up, and recognize again, the majority of the money for the fraternity comes through per capita fees and initiation fees. Even today, I guarantee you it'll be 75, 80% of your money. It's fine to get the graduate money, but a lot of that goes to the foundation, which doesn't go into the general operating revenue of the fraternity. So the fraternity really operates off of the collegiate structure. And then, of course, the third great growth period is the proliferation of pharmacy schools. We went from 73, 74 to now we're 150 and counting. And one of the most impressive things to me, I mean, I'm literally amazed how many new chapters that you've started. I realize what effort it takes to get a collegiate chapter going. And I said, well, where's the people power coming to get all this done? And I know it's shared among the executive committee, but I realize now, because students go to the national meetings like APHA so much, that actually in some cases there's students from the new school meeting the Kappa brothers at APHA and say, well, we want a chapter. So it's coming from the other direction too. But those three things really have provided the growth and the stability for our fraternity. That's the three biggest changes. Of course, if you went back prior to that 46 or 47, we went from like 1930 to 1945, between the Depression and the World War II, that half our chapters were dormant. Right. That's the reason when we have 50th anniversary, 75th, and 100th, really virtually none of those chapters were active over that whole period of time. They all were inactive. If you go back into World War I, where we were an all-male fraternity, where they were off to war. In fact, the pharmacy school at Ole Miss, one of those years, graduated one person. It was a female, 1942, I think. But that, I've digressed away from, I guess, what the questions were you gave me, but that came to me as we talked about it. Well, the other person I have to mention before we go on, and that's Brian Reister, because Brian and I are here in Oxford, and of course he came down here from Drake and got his PhD here and stayed with MME. I know you're probably going to even interview him, but he's been to more province meetings you can count. You know, I told you I never went to a province meeting until after I was on the executive committee, but after, I don't know how many I've been to, 50, 75, but I can guarantee you now, Brian has passed me in that area. I did, when I was Grand Regent, I did try to visit every province. So I went to every province. I've been to every one at least once. And some of my memories I have go back to those province assemblies. Well, I mentioned the province, I have to talk in terms of the old terms, but Province 5, I was impressed with that because it was on the other end of the spectrum of just doing all kinds of things over 3 or 4 days. The converse of that was Province, I guess it's Province 9, California. It was California, Arizona, New Mexico back then. And their province meeting consisted of an hour at the APHA meeting in Las Vegas, or their states. I mean, literally they weren't doing much at all. In fact, I can remember at one time, Don probably would tell me, don't say this, but some of them didn't even realize it was a province structure. And of course, again, when I mentioned GCDs, I didn't mention Don Ferretti, but I want to tell you, he has done a tremendous job for as long as I remember at Gamma Nu, and even back when the national president, Ralph Saroyan, for Phi Delta Chi, I thought he was appointed for life, but he really was president for about 10 years, and he was involved with student activities at Stockton, but Kappa Psi still was just going gangbusters despite that through all those years. Don certainly is among the top 4 or 5 Grand Council deputy people that I ever knew. Other province meetings, I remember province, the old province 2, which was Philadelphia. Ada chapter was hosting one there that we went over to the casinos in Atlantic City. I can remember we got a free ride and some free tickets to go spend a lot more money at the casinos there. When I went up there, it gave me a chance again to visit with the Philadelphia graduate chapter, which was the oldest graduate chapter in the country. I remember going with Frank Eby and Jack Atkinson out to that. Of course, the province experience I had up in 10, and I was supervisor of Province 3 for almost 10 years back in the 70s, and that was Maryland, West Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. North Carolina, the top 2 chapters really back at that time, and most of our chapters have up and downs through the years. I think Maryland went inactive and active about 3 times through their Sigma chapter. Maybe one of the best now, but you have those lulls, and I can remember Beta Xi and Gamma Xi, North Carolina, South Carolina. They were by far the strongest 2 chapters. In fact, I realized at that time that they were spending so much money on the province assembly that the other chapters in the province were reluctant to even host. And of course that's kind of a negative too. It's good that they could raise that kind of money, but the other chapters realized that it appeared to be expensive, but they didn't really have to spend that much money. Of course, Beta Xi, we have a number of chapters that have houses, still in a minority, but there are only 2 that I remember that housed about 40 members. One of them was Beta Xi, North Carolina, right in front of the golf course, and then the chapter at Fargo, North Dakota, was it Beta Sigma? I may have the name wrong, but anyway, they had one that I remember going up to North Dakota to Fargo to a province meeting. I went up there as Colonel Rebel, like the band director here that later went to Notre Dame. He loaned me that whole costume. I carried it on the plane, went up there for a Halloween party. But I can remember they had triple pane windows in their house. I'd never heard of it. You know, coming from the South, we don't think about that, but they had triple panes. And I remember they had this brick wall by the door at the front. And of course, we have some of those kind of brick structures here. You put your garbage can behind it, but I realized it was angled with the door. And I asked about it, and they told me, said, well, in the wintertime, if they didn't have that brick wall there, when they opened the door, they couldn't shut it because of the wind. Some 10 years later, we hit that period of time in the 70s when, again, maybe in the 70s, 80s, when the oil became so expensive, and they began to brick up a lot of that glass. They had a Sell a Brick campaign to change out some of that glass with bricks because their utility bills were so expensive. And of course, Province 7, my own host province, you know, I remember I enjoyed going there because what you find in your province is that after you graduate, there's just a handful of people, a small number, that will go year after year after year. And that's probably the one negative that the older members had about reorganizing the province, is because they were used to going. You know, I'd go to 7 and it'd be Ben Welch. It's another person I should have talked about because he now is deceased. But Ben and Johnny and Lynette and Charles Carden and Paul Knick, O.D., St. Louis, we always were there every year, and you look forward to seeing those same people at the province assemblies. But the other side of it is, aside from the strategic needs to restructure, to make it better travel and what have you, you also get to know new people that you didn't ever know before when you wind up going to that. And then sometimes I've looked at it and said, well, you know, if we split up our province and half of us are in this one, half of us in another, then why don't one year we all go to this one, the next year we all go to the other one. But it's worked out very good. Ben Welch, so I mentioned Ben because I got to know Ben Welch first when I was the supervisor of Province 3. Ben was a satrap. And he and Mike Dewey were the two people that really made that province go at that time. And then Ben, of course, he moved later to southwest Oklahoma. And, he was the webmaster that really got rid of the technology of the web. He really developed that. And I remember he's one of those guys, like a lot of us, that didn't win every election we ever ran for, but the thing that I always admired about Ben is he'd get right back in there and he'd go again. And of course, ultimately he wound up as a Grand Regent in the fraternity. But Ben he was a unique person in it. The Southwestern Graduate Chapter, they would present an annual report at the meeting, and they would talk about all their travels, and it was all fictitious. I mean, they made up all this stuff, put it into a slide presentation, had their own airplane, and so forth. That was Ben Welch. He and Lenny Nager are two people of a kind, really. You know, how do you define success? I really don't define it so much as a point in time or a place, but it really is a process that sort of takes place. You know, you go down this road, you set your goals, you set your priorities, and then you try to meet those. From a professional standpoint, when I started to college, like most students, I didn't have a clue of what I really wanted to do. At the end of my freshman year, I had done pretty good in chemistry and physics, and I said, well, what can I do with that? And I said, I don't want to fool with test tubes all my life. But I looked at pharmacy and I said, you know, that's people-oriented. Didn't have any family ever been in pharmacy. But once I said that, then, you know, success then comes in terms of going to college, getting your degree, getting licensed, getting out in practice, and then meeting patient needs from a professional standpoint. From a personal standpoint, with my wife Barbara and I, we've been married now for 54 years. We have two sons. One of them is adopted. They were 13 years apart. And now I have two grandkids, so certainly success we kind of measure it in terms not only of the marriage and the kids, but you know, how happy and successful they are in life. And we've certainly been fortunate in that. I know when I came to Ole Miss in the fall of 1962, fall of 1961, my mother had breast cancer and she died the next spring. So I only knew my mother, she was 44 when she died, and my father, he lived to be about 70, I guess 75. He lived about 3 years after I came back from Houston to be on the faculty at Ole Miss, but certainly the family from a personal standpoint. Now, fraternally, you know, I guess we try on a daily basis, I would hope, to live up to our fraternal ideals, industry, sobriety, fellowship, high ideals, you know, to not say untoward things, give our brothers the benefit of the doubt. Certainly from a success, I would hope that we could do that kind of thing. For 17 years, I served on the executive committee representing the fraternity, and I would say particularly as Grand Regent for the two terms of 4 years, I try to tell myself every day, you represent the fraternity. You don't represent Beta Rho chapter. You don't represent the province. In fact, the first Grand Council convention I went to after I was elected Grand Regent, I didn't even go to the caucuses of my home province because I didn't want to give the impression that one was more important than the other, because you truly represent the fraternity as Grand Regent, and the thing I realized was that the degree of importance that the Brotherhood has for the Grand Regent. I mean, there's a tremendous respect, not for the person that's in there, but for the office itself. And I can remember, well, for example, you have the Grand Council Convention coming up this time. I looked at the list of candidates. I see 3 people on the list for Grand Regent. Now, my personal feeling always was I wouldn't put my name on the ballot if I wasn't running. But I realize that's not necessarily the case with Grand Regent. The immediate Grand Regent has a tendency to leave their name on and then withdraw at the convention, and that's the intent to do it. I don't know whether that's Lather's or not, but they do have, oftentimes they do it. I told Bill Fitzpatrick at the time I ran, he left his on, and but I knew he wasn't going to run again at that time. I didn't want mine on because I don't want people thinking, well, are they going to really run? But in the past, we had a lot of people on the ballot for each of the offices. We don't have that many today, but from the Grand Regent standpoint, when I looked at it, and it's a little different now because you don't really have an all-day executive committee meeting the day after the convention like we used to. But I would tell people when they were running for Grand Regent, I'd say what you need to be planning on right now is you have your agenda ready for what you're going to do after the convention, because there's too much going on at the convention to set it during that time. And then run that way. Of course, some people told me, said, well, they like to have another name on the ballot because then nobody can be nominated off of the floor, which technically that's true. But I say to myself, you know, I'm running for Grand Regent. If somebody can be nominated off of the floor and get more votes than me, then I didn't have any business running for Grand Regent in the first place. Because I've realized the members, you know, they may tend to support their drinking buddy for graduate member at large or something, but when you get up to Grand Regent, I mean, they're looking at whether or not that person can really provide the leadership for the fraternity. So, again, I would have said, if I'm running, then they're going to let me regardless, and I didn't want to worry about that. Some people say, well, you don't have to campaign during the week if you do it, and I'm looking at it again saying, well, you really need to go to the caucus, you need to meet, because you need to be talking about what you're going to do and what ideas you got for the growth of the fraternity. So you still, regardless where you got anybody running or not, you still are going through the same process to do that. But I guess that's a rambling discussion of success in terms of personal, professional, and certain fraternity. Current executive committee is doing an outstanding job, and by all accounts, what I see, they certainly are. I read the mass from front to back, every issue, and see what is going on. I used to see the budget every year and go through the budget with a fine-tooth comb, but I hadn't done that in recent years. You know, the reality on the executive committee is that in many respects, the Grand Regent has to take charge and responsibility of the budget. When I had the opportunity to serve 2 years as Grand Regent with a 17-member board. And the second 2 years, it was with an 8-member board. And in both cases, I got virtually no input really on the financial side. You know, I'd sit down, Bob McGarren says, night and day, and go over with him the budget. But if you look at the budget, about half, and I hadn't seen it in recent times, but about half of it's going to be to operate the central office, and about a fourth of it's for the mask, and the other fourth is for the rest of the stuff, which is primarily officer travel, I guess. I'd bet it's still in somewhat that same framework, although the budget that I had was about a tenth of what the budget is, the current budget is today. But when you think about people running for office, the thing is, our process, you nominate 4 months out, I believe it is. And then that really doesn't tell you who's running, because then you got to see who accepts those positions. Right. So maybe the better place to look to see what the interest was how many people were actually nominated. Then you begin to see, well, how many people decided because they thought it was going too good, they didn't change in there. But you never lose to have your name on the ballot for national office. You mix with people. You get to know them through the week and the caucuses and the different social functions and what I always did, I always loved to look around the hall and see the reaction of people when they did not get elected. And I've seen some that were really good stories. You know, I see people, they didn't get elected, and I tended to try to speak to them even before I was speaking to the people who got elected, because it's easy to win, but it's not nearly so easy. And really it's not lose. I don't ever use the word lose with somebody. You just didn't get elected. I mean, if you've got one office and 10 people running, we know that one's going to get elected and 9 aren't.
Right.
But, you know, you put your name. I did the same thing with the Professional Fraternity Association. When I went over there, I got so much value for Kappa Psi when I represented Kappa Psi at the Professional Fraternity Convention. We had a new editor, we had a new executive director, and I was taking notes from the presentations. I'd go back home, I'd type those notes up, and I'd send these notes to Bob McGarry, and I'd send these notes to Tony Palmieri. Neither one of them were business, professionally trained people. They were scientists. And as far as being able to run an office, that wasn't their training. And then they would take that from the PFA meeting. I could get that information, so when it came time, somebody asked me, well, would you run for an office? And I said, well, I'd be happy to be an officer because I'm getting so much out of it, I need to give you something back. And it turned out at that meeting, they came back just before the election and said, well, we're not going to need you. I said, well, that's fine. And then 2 months later, I'm at the house and I get this call and says, well, you know, the treasurer of our PFA has resigned and moved to Bolivia. Said, would you consider being the treasurer? I said, okay, I will. They boxed the stuff up, sent me a couple of boxes, and I came into the next convention saying, well, you know, I'm ready to run for treasurer now. And somebody came and said, well, would you be willing to be vice president? And I said, well, I will if you want me to do that. So I actually wound up in the middle of the mix, and I was the president of PFA and out in about half the time. Most people, the disadvantage to me was I wasn't on there as long. But again, from an office standpoint, if people run and you know, look at it as a learning experience, then it's a win. It's a win every time. And most of our brothers through the years have really done just that. I can name you some people that were Grand Regent, including myself, that were not successful in the election process at the national level. But in the end, you know, they did well. That if they couldn't help there, they'd help somewhere else. But they always got involved. And usually, that's the reason with Christie, I was so proud when she got elected, because it was 2 or 3 times your committee's going to be reelected this time. I said, no, Tony, they're not. And I didn't have any particular one that I felt was not, but when you get there and they get to caucusing and talking, there's always one or two will be new on the executive committee every time. And it doesn't mean necessarily, you know, somebody that got left off may have done a really good job. In fact, I remember the last one I went to, I think in Florida, there was one person that got left off, and I said, man, I hate to see a person get left because they were doing such a good job. But at the same time, I realized that you had limited spots to be able to actually get elected. You know, a couple of people that I didn't mention that I'd like to be on record with, and one of them was Dick Dewey, Grand Ritualist Emeritus. he and his wife Gloria, his wife was actually the national president of LKS or KE1. I can never remember which, but Dick Doty was a guy that he had been on a number of years before I came in. But I remember talking about stories, Psi chapters, University of Tennessee. When Frank Eby did the history book back in the mid-60s, he literally went over all the charters and chartering of the chapters, and he found a Psi chapter and he couldn't locate any of the charter members, and he didn't know what had happened and couldn't figure it out. He sent Dick Doty down to Memphis, and Doty went down there and he found that Richard Bliss, who's one of the 8 people, is legends, and certainly one of the legends. I digress real quickly. I had 8 people legends. I didn't want to put people who were contemporaries of mine. Nick Finney was the only one who was still living, and he was really a different generation. He was almost 90 years old. But Richard, I've never found anybody that said to me, well, this person ought not be a legend. Now, you could name it somebody else, but of those 8 were Richard Bliss from 10 to 41 till he died, was editor of the Mask. But what Doty found when he went down to Memphis was that Richard Bliss, in order to get that chapter going, there were a number of people gave him money to put on a rush party, and he had like $1,000 way back when. And these people that gave him the money were not Kappa Psi brothers, but he made them all charter members. So Frank, when he found that out, he actually made Psi chapter recharter the chapter. It all came out, but Doty was the guy that went down there. And then the other person that I have so many fond memories of is Jack Atkinson. He did serve for a time on the executive committee, was never Grand Regent. He actually was on the ballot for Grand Regent, I think, at the 200th anniversary of our country, the one we had in Philadelphia, but wasn't elected. Bill Fitzpatrick was re-elected as the Grand Regent. It kind of hurt Jack a little bit, but Jack, he was one of those that looked at the financial statements real careful. I can remember going out to his home. I may have been an appointed member at that time, one of those appointed members, and I don't know who got upset more, he or Jerry Delaney, about having a budget in which it wasn't balanced. You'd have the income would exceed, or the expenses would exceed the income actually in it, and they would debate that issue. But now, Jack Atkinson, he worked for SmithKline French, and he was the one that kind of was really good friends of Eby, and he kind of linked me in on that. I went up in their home at one time with them. But Jack, and he would go do some chapter visitations and what. He'd do it mostly on his own, and he kind of set that convention up in Philly. People wonder, how in the world can you have a convention on the 200th anniversary? How can you get a hotel? And I remember going out, my wife Barbara and I, our son Deary, we went out to Valley Forge for the fireworks the night before, and once there was 50,000 people in the park, they closed the park. We got in there for all this fireworks, and then we got back downtown, and we were in like a 30-story Holiday Inn or something like that. And they had the parade the next day, and it was out there parade. And then on Sunday morning, I never will forget, they had Gerald Ford, President of the United States, was speaking there. And we'd been up most of the night and was tired. We didn't get up and go down there for it, but I never will forget, 10 o'clock, they show Ford up there, and Deary, he was 14, he must have been probably 10 or 11 years old at the time. He looks and said, Daddy said, there's Larry Slater, Larry Lee Slater from Kansas City. There he was on the front row. And I later found out that he went in with the photographers. They thought he was a photographer. Larry was another one that for a long time, he was on the executive committee, and in Kansas City. I remember going to Province meeting, again going back to Province meeting. We went to one in Morgantown, West Virginia. And I remember we flew on a plane from Morgantown back to, I guess it's Pittsburgh, to fly back, and it was raining and the wind was blowing, and I literally thought Larry Slater was holding the door to, and you could see the pilot in there flying. But Slater, he was really popular because he went. He was really popular in Province 8, which was Brian Reister's home province. I considered a long time having a chapter in the history book on women's interest in the Kappa Psi, and I'd put together some of it, but it got back to just what I was saying here, is I didn't want to leave somebody out that really contributed early. You know, I mentioned Annette Wheel from Road Chapter in Province 7. There were a couple of satraps, first satraps up in Province 8. There was a girl, Barbara Rowlands from Minnesota, Epsilon Chapter, and then there was one other girl up there. But then I got to thinking, well, I'm gonna miss somebody when I get into this. And I remember the Grand Council Convention at South Padre Island. There was a girl from Sigma Chapter there. And she and Annette Will are the first two people that I remember, female members, that were at the National Convention. It seems strange now because I'm sure there's more women than there were men now, but that's why I knew that the two chapters that started, you know, you could figure one ahead of the other if you look at the actual initiation date in that spring, but I never did look at that. But there's another interesting sidebar on that. You know, we never included on the M card gender.
Right.
It never, to this day, it's never been on there. So the only way you really knew is when you got to read, if you saw Mary and Jane and Sally, if you saw enough of them names, you knew that this chapter was co-ed.
Yes.
But literally, that's the only way that you would have picked up. And I realized in San Francisco and Duquesne that they had enough in there. I knew that they'd gone female. But I can remember another sidebar, you know, you don't have alcoholic beverages in the meetings, official meetings, the National Convention. And what brought that, we did. And when they had all the long time debate over whether or not to include women in the fraternity, it went on and 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and they were bringing beer in and what have you, and it got kind of rowdy. And that was what precipitated the one of the rule change, I guess, house rules, what have you. But to this day after that, it never happened because it got so rowdy. You know, the other thing about our election process, we talked about it briefly, is we had an election, it may have been in Kansas City. Bruce Martin, that was the dean at Duquesne, wonderful Kappa Psi brother, he was we were having an election for, it might have been graduate member at large, but he and one other person were on the ballot for 6 or 7 or 8 votes, and it just kept going because you had to have 50% of the votes that were recorded, and some of the people had left the room. It's not on the ones that are in the room, it's the total. And they couldn't finally Bruce stood up and he withdrew his name. And the other person got, I don't remember who it was, but the other thing with Bruce Martin, it's really important, when our first collegiate chapter in the School of Pharmacy was Gamma Chapter at Columbia University. It actually started in 1898. It was a City of New York College of Pharmacy, and later they were incorporated into Columbia. But when they closed the School of Pharmacy around 1976, and Bruce went over there representing the fraternity at their last meeting, and he collected their charter and the list of the people who was there, and took it back to I guess at the time it was Frank Eby. Maybe it was after Eby. Anyway, took it back to the central office. But I still hear from him every now and then. He spends the summers up in Pittsburgh, and he spends the winters in Barbados.
Oh.
And wonderful guy, but I remember that one time we couldn't get, the election process is so grueling anyway. I'm going to be interested to see how it goes when you do this electronic balloting, because I used to count the ballots for several years, and I'd say at the end of that, man, it's 3 hours long. I was exhausted just counting the ballots. I finally, the last time that I was asked to do it, I actually turned it down. I think Norman Campbell, he just keeps doing it, but I look, I said, man, it's so physically demanding to go through every one of those ballots process, because you just drop one name each time.
Yeah.
That's another thing. You know, I showed you how many people run. You think about that when you went from 10 to 9 to 8 to 7 to 6. Now, it won't take that long, even if you don't have electronic ballots this time, because you don't have that many counted. That's another thing. It led to a house rule change, and that is, we had people that would get up one and then another and tell jokes in between the thing, and some of them got kind of shady. And I think it was Pat Wells said, we're not going to have any more jokes. It was told while the votes being counted. And I think to this day they don't do that anymore either. I guess between 1978 and 85, the year before I was Grand Regent, the time I was Grand Regent, I really was putting almost my entire life into Kappa Psi, and to a degree I neglected home. As Barbara will tell you, my wife, well, I raised our second son while you were off doing all this stuff, but because of the nature of things, at the time I felt like I needed to put more time, because we had a new editor, we had a new executive director, and I felt like, you know, I'm the one that's got to get this done, this Grand Regent, but I guess with that, my job at the university, no question, I probably cost myself some money and promotion. I got promoted, but you know, rightly so, I wasn't producing particular research to the degree that I needed to. And that really carried on through. Once I got in Grand Regent and I was representing the fraternity, when I went to PFA, I wound up, there was a lady that was the first president of PFA. She said, well, you need to represent PFA at the National Interfraternity Foundation. And I got to go and do it, and that. And of course, it worked good for Kappa Psi, because the National Interfraternity Foundation represents social sororities and social fraternities, but also represents PFA. They're all three prongs in there. And Balfour, with the Balfour scholarships, and Buddy Cote was there. They were our official jewelers, so I knew there was people. And then I got involved with the Center for the Study of the College Fraternity, which is the only research-oriented group in the fraternal group in the world, I guess, out of University of Indiana. So I got doing all these things, and then finally, when I became chair of the department, 1992, I withdrew from the NFA, from the NIH, and from the Center of Studies College Fraternity. I was vice president of both. I was ready literally going to the presidency of both those positions, and I said I can't do that, be chair. So I pulled back some. I spent a lot of time fraternity-wise with the history, really about 10 years, but the latter year or two is when I did most of the work. And the university gave me a sabbatical for a semester. I sit right here at this very table, right here. I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, I work a while, I get tired, I eat lunch, and I work in the afternoon on the history book. And that's another subject that I could get to talking a lot about. You know, there were certain parts of that book that I really enjoyed doing. The early history, I got every scrap of the early history I could find. And again, Nick Finney helped me with that, and some of that stuff that I got from New England. Like I realized in New Haven that the corner of 8th and Orange is where the first original Eel House chapter said. I went there, it's a vacant lot, deserted, kind of a rundown area of New Haven. And then he took me to the second place to work. And the law school at Yale University sits right on the spot. And he said, now there's still a Hill House High School that's across the city now. It's not near as prestigious as it was back then at that time. And then we go down to Cheshire, and Cheshire, I mean, Cheshire Academy's still there. It's a prep school for girls and boys, about 250 students from like 25 countries in the world. I mean, it's big time today. But I met the schoolmaster there, they call him a headmaster. And I saw where the Kappa Psi chapter sat, and there's an old wooden Kappa Psi paddle that somehow he got given to Nick Finney, and new chapter has it. I kind of wanted him to give it $100, but they didn't. He and Kelly up at Connecticut, they decided they wanted to keep it. I hope it's still there. But I remembered, you know, the time that I spent doing that. I actually traveled some to get that data. I went to the New York Library. The City of New York Library is on like 48th Street, just a beautiful building. Yeah. I went in to see what they had in there. That 150-page history that Henry Jekyll wrote is there, and it had they have all of the issues of the mask up to 1976, and then we quit sending them unto them. We needed to get them the rest of them, because they even had the first 6 years that we didn't have, because Preston Eldridge lived in New York City, and the national conventions were there from 1906 to 10. So they were storing it, and of course I'm asking the library, I'm saying, you know, if y'all decide you don't want this, going to throw this stuff out, let me know. That woman looked at me like I'd struck her with a rod or something. She said, so we don't get rid of anything here. So everything's here is going to stay here. She said, if we don't have any room, we'll build another building. But so I said, well, it'll be there if anybody wants to go see it. But there they had it on site. They had these 2 rooms that mirror each other with a chandelier deal, real reading room. They went in there and got it for me then and brought it out. But Jekyll, it amazes me that he had a laboratory, pharmaceutical laboratory in New York City. But that early history, when Bliss and Grant, who was the Grand Regent, and I think it was the historian, 3 people went back to New Haven, and they interviewed these people, F. Harvey Smith's mother and some of these original members, and then Bliss says, well, I'm going to publish it in the Mask, and he never did. And then Jekyll, it was 1913 when it did that. Well, in 1947, like 30 years later, Jekyll, from his notes, writes that history. And all of that, and it has these people's name in there and every bit of it. But I see, you know, from that alone, what he contributed. But they were all centered right in that area, you know, the country at that time. I mentioned the parts I liked. I liked working on that early history because I found just about everything you can find. When Mike and Callie did that update on the history, he mentioned a couple of ideas of how to go back and find some more data, and it was never followed up on. But the one thing I always thought they could have followed up on, even today, and that's where F. Harvey Smith is buried. We know he was in L.A. He was in L.A., and you know there's a cemetery, and then a lot of that stuff's even online now if you could figure out what cemetery. But in the same way, Eby replaced who was the guy who was executive director from 41 to 54, Ray Kelly. He died. Well, I realized when I was looking back there, he was operating a fraternity out of his home. But, I mean, he's dead, but there was only like one generation of his family behind him, and they're still living. And I think about, well, what do they have that they might have had that he had since he had the whole office? Right. And it moved from there to Frank Eby's home. And they had it in his home, in the office. And when I visited him, he went downstairs in his basement, he had all these charters and looking for Beta Rho because we never found the Beta Rho chapter. We have the petition on the wall, but if they ever got a charter, I don't have it. And then like from 20, we switched from pharmacy to medicine, to just pharmacy in 1925. Well, see, that was only about 5 years before the Depression hit. And the chapters, they were kind of dormant even not even thinking about when the war came. So a lot of them were vacant, but forgot what we were talking about earlier now, getting myself off of it. Well, about the early history of what you could find out today from it. There was a 10-year period of the U.S. Census that was burned in a fire that they don't have, and it was like around 1880 or 1890. But I realized some of those people, like when Richard Bliss died, his widow, he died, they were living in a hotel in Birmingham, and she shipped it was like a U-Haul truck worth of stuff up to Ray Kelly. Well, Ray's operating out of his office, so I don't know what it worries me about what we'd lose of the records. Right. In fact, if you're interested later today or in the morning, I'll show you some of that stuff I have, but I was always leery to send it in the pack out because Bob had limited space and he was storing it in totes across the campus. And then it goes over to Southwestern, and Scott Long's got limited amount of space, and then finally it gets to Johnny. I got pretty much confidence Johnny's going to keep up with what he got, but I sent him some stuff that there's no way, if it's gone forever. But I had some of it because when I was working on the history book, I wanted to make sure it all got back out there. But we don't have the best storage for our archives because of space. But anyway, the other chapter that I really enjoyed working on was the songs of Kappa. There's only a half a dozen songs that the lyrics and the words and the music was all written by Kappa. And I got a chance to talk to at least half those people were still living. The Sweetheart song was written by the sister of a brother at Beta Sigma, the one in North Dakota. And those two or three, there was four of them that took that song to Washington to the convention, and two of them are still living. One of them had a drugstore up in North Dakota. And then the Shield of Kappa Psi and the Kappa Psi Drinking Song were written by really two brothers at New Chapter that came back after the war. One of them was in the big band here, and he played for the soldier. I mean, the guy was an accomplished musician. And apparently he wrote, this other guy told me, he said, well, really, he wrote the, said, we were sitting out there on the steps at the fraternity house at New Chapter, and said, you know, we ought to have a drinking song. And the other said, well, said, if you'll write the words, I'll write the lyrics. And then this guy told me, because the other one was dead, the other one was living in Florida. But he said, well, the other guy really wrote both the words and the lyrics. But they had that, and then there was one, it was a dedication song to Walter Williams. That somebody up at Mu Omicron Pi wrote it. But there's very few. Now, we have all kinds of songs that they took popular music of the day and put the words to them. But I enjoyed that chapter a lot. Some of it's tedious, the awards and all that, and all these names, and man, that drive me crazy, all these citations we gave out, chapters given out. But I enjoyed the interview bit, like you're doing this. Past Grand Regents and the executive directors. And the reason I was telling you could edit this out the way you wish. Some of the, you wouldn't believe some of the ramblings or some of that. I accused one of them of being drunk on the beach writing that thing, but I mean, I spent 4 times as much time editing it to get it to where it would read right to what the time they put into it. But I enjoyed that that particular part. I guess those were the most fun parts of the book. A lot of that on chapter news and everything was really an update using the format that Eby used. And most people always call it Eby's book, but I tell you, Finney had a lot to do working with that too. That's the other question that I always ask those people that you might ask sometime is, based on the time you were serving as Grand Regent, who was serving as executive director, who were the top grant regents that you had? Of course, Evie always told me Finney was at the top of the list. Glenn Sporandio was up there pretty good too, but I've asked them because they know, and then I asked Finney the same thing. He was a little bit less open to talk about some of that. Well, the biggest challenge that I faced was our financial situation when I took over as Grand Regent, and I purposely didn't put any, I don't think I put any of that in the history book because I don't want to talk about the negative, and it really wasn't so much, we just didn't have the money. It wasn't that the people diverted the money or didn't use it right or what have you. And I realized as I look back years later after that, I didn't have near as much difficulty because of the financial situation as Norm Campbell had when he took over. And I didn't know that when I went to New Orleans in '72, none of that, but they hadn't met in 3 years. They had no money. The executive director, Gerald Henney, from 1965 to '70, it's the only time we ever had a full-time executive director, ever. And he bought a printing press and whole bit in the central office, and I remember Jim Seymour told me one time, he said, we went to a funeral up in New York. He said, you thought it was the presidential entourage. So we had all these black limousines and we were down here and what have you. But anyway, Henney went up to Rhode Island province meeting, and he had an aneurysm, December the 4th, 1969. And he was in a coma for over 2 months before he died. He never recovered. And Norm and Pat Wells and Sporandio and a couple of others, they went to St. Louis to the central office, and they had a deposit box, and they didn't have a key, and they got somebody to drill into the box, and they thought they'd find it. They didn't find nothing hardly, but Henney did a lot of stuff on microfiche. I used that when I was doing the history book. You just go batty after you look at that a while going through that stuff. But anyway, Frank Eby told me, it's even in the records, that when he went out in '65 and Henney took over, they had 4 $10,000 CDs. And it wasn't there. There wasn't no money there. They didn't have it. And that's the reason they waited till '72 to have a meeting. And everybody went to New Orleans paid their own way. You didn't have any money. But I don't think Henney, I don't think he diverted the money for himself. I just think that he lived lavishly he was 100% Kappa Psi. No one ever believed he wasn't. And, but when he died, they didn't know. But it was somewhat that way in '79, and I mean, our total income was like $60,000, and California was expensive. We were $20,000 in the hole on a $60,000 budget. And that's when we came up with the Fund for Progress. We had no graduate dues structure. We had a voluntary, but we weren't getting any money. And again, when I went to the PFA and Bill Jenkins with the group dynamics of the professional fundraisers out of St. Louis, and a guy, Ernie White, one of the law firms, they said, well, Dewey, this is what you need to do. You need to fund. And Ernie White said, well, call it the Fund for Progress. Said nobody can feel bad about progress. And we sent out about $10,000 requests. We got like $20,000. We got, time we paid the postage and everything, $10,000 or $15,000. And then William R. and them gave me $7,500 up at the convention, and we got back on footing. But we also moved from paying rent in California to no rent in Oklahoma. We got our money back. But again, it wasn't that people wasn't spending the money right. We just didn't have enough money coming in And it's more expensive in California than it was
Right.
in Oklahoma. Vic Yancey, the Kappa Psi brother, was dean. He gave us a free space. We had a whole house for the fraternity office. Later it wound up in the new modern school bit, but that house was nicer than the other day. And we had the whole house, big brick house. But that was a challenge to, you know, to get the finances, because we couldn't do chapter visitations, and that was hurting us. And I was appointing people as province supervisors based on the fact that they were in that province and in that region. It wasn't cost us any money to send them. But that limits you, because then you're not sending people from other regions that they get to meet and see. We worked out of it primarily through that way, the mask. I mean, today we got so much more money. We're spending more money on the mask today than we had in our total budget in '79. But that was a challenge. And of course, the other challenge is to, and it comes down really just a little work, a little leadership to get the provinces organized the way they ought to be. We had no uniformity at all what was going on across the province. They were all doing some things that were good, some things were a lot better than others. But I think that organizing those more, the business of province realignment, there's a lot of discussion in the history book on that, but you know, Pat Wells was the one that initially wanted to change that. It wasn't ever done. Kelly just finally took it and did it, and there wasn't much to do about it once it was done. But you know, it was a challenge. But in fact, that was one reason when I was reelected the second time, I kind of wanted to. We were just getting back on the ground to be able to do the things that we really wanted to do. But I realized after the fact that it wasn't here the problem that Norm Campbell inherited when he came in '72. And of course we didn't have a big crowd in New Orleans because they were all coming at their own expense, but we had a pretty good crowd. When we went to Detroit in '81, we had 100 people there. Wow. Total. Now you got 700, 800, but we had 100 people. And it was almost the kind of deal where you're saying, we're better off if they don't come from here because that's so far, and the money to send them was so much. But I guess that was the biggest challenge. Well, the older you get more maturity and more experience, and you look back and say, well, you know, I'd have rather done it this way. I feel like it gets back to this business about I only have pleasant memories that I think back on. And I hope that I hadn't, you know, hurt people's feelings or what have you, certain things you've done, certain things you could have done a little different, a little more tactful. Again, keeping that in mind, give the brother the benefit of the doubt to go, because basically the people, you know, I mean, they chose to be in Kappa Psi, and you get out of what you put into it. I just felt like, you know, there's things that are done and there are things that are said over time that you say, well, you wish that had been a little bit different. I think 99%, 98% is right, maybe 2% I might do it a little bit differently. Well, personally, my wife and my sons certainly know me. Professionally, I guess a couple of people that I haven't mentioned. One of them is Mickey Smith, who was editor of the Mask at one time. He was my department chair. He was my major professor. He's a renowned pharm ed professor, still lives here in town. Mickey certainly knows me well. He was my chair. I was later his chair. He was from St. Louis. Henny that I mentioned, the executive director, that was Mickey's master's thesis professor, was Gerald Henny. He would be one. The other one would be Ken Roberts. Ken Roberts was my first PhD student. And then he later was my dean for 10 years. And
I knew him when he was at Psi Chapter in Memphis. He and Oaf up there ran that chapter really well. Of course, he went to Kentucky, so I've known Ken, through the years. They're certainly professionally, as well as fraternally. Both of those people are Kappa Psi brothers too. The other, from a fraternity standpoint, Norm Campbell, because I've known him since he got me started, really. And then Bob McGarren and Tony Palmieri, we've just been around each other so many years. And then the other one, I guess I'd mentioned, I hadn't known him quite as long as them, but almost, is Johnny Porter. And then I went, of course, he followed me as president of the PFA later on. So, in fact, when he was president, I stayed with him at the convention. So I've known him for a long time. I guess, there's a lot of other people, but I'd put those. Even my former dean, Charlie Hartman, that came here from Georgia, outstanding dean, died at 50. About 4 months before I defended my dissertation, he was on my dissertation committee, got broadsided by a train going to a public health meeting in Jackson. But he was always positive. The guy was really, the research institute we have now, 40 years ago, he had the drawings down for what they're doing. He really got the school off and going. I ought to do a better job in terms of managing the finances and the budget and that, because that's what I'm trained in. Bob was trained in medicinal chemistry, or Ben Welch was a clinical guy. Palmieri was a pharmaceutics guy. Palmieri did a great job. He's another that moved up. When he took over as editor, one of the reasons why I kind of thought he needed to be editor, one of them was because he was in Laramie, Wyoming, which was in the low-income route, and then he had a local printer there that helped him, because he didn't know anything about it, but he helped him a lot. He was a good scientific writer, author for research. But then when he went to Kalamazoo, again, I told him, well, you need to go to Maury Boyd Competence in Indianapolis, and I got that from the PFA, knowing, in fact, Moxley is the one that later did the history book. But because they professionally could help him. That was their business, and they critiqued the masses. And then I got him to go into the College Fraternity Editors Association. I'm thinking, man, we're spending 25% of our money on our publication, so we ought to be paying his way to that annual meeting once a year. Well, he goes and he gets to learning, and he winds up president of the College Fraternity Editors Association. It's the same way with Johnny. When he goes, they wind up moving up in those positions. In fact, that'll get to a question later on, so I just let it ride. I sort of split it out between what I'd call more of an honor than an accomplishment, but I was certainly honored to serve for 17 years on the executive committee, and especially as the 4 years as Grand Regent. I also, honored to have served 36 years as the Grand Council Deputy for Beta Rho, from 71 when I came back to 2009. Really, I was GCD, and then accomplishments, the history book. I'm certainly proud of that. I mentioned several times Tony and Bob, but I certainly am proud of the fact that, and of course the executive committee voted on them, but I largely selected those people, and they turned out to be so outstanding, really. Bob served for 20 years as executive director, and Tony about 16 as editor. I looked at that and say, well, about 5% of that was me and what I helped them with them. The other 95% is what they did. They made it happen. But I've always said that my greatest achievement as a department chair for 12 years here with Farm Ad is recruiting and retaining competent people. You can't be as successful if you're having constant turnover. Right. And you don't need turnover. One of the reasons for our fraternity all the way back through history is the executive director position has been very stable. Mm-hmm. And the same way with the editor. I mean, you take Bliss starts and goes for 30 years before you change to another one. We only had about 4 and 5 in 100 years. Mm-hmm. So the achievements really in essence is the history book and my part in recruiting and keeping both Tony and Bob. I'll give you, we've hit a couple of them earlier, but I'll give you 3. I mentioned the memory of going up to Province 10 with Craig Johnson. I mean, and I really didn't take the whole story. I actually flew in. I took the opportunity to go and visit with Beta Omicron and the Seattle graduate chapter. Mm-hmm. Both of those were really strong. And Bill Fassett that was there. He took me up to British Vancouver, and we went up and visited that school and chapter, and then we went over the mountain in April, and it was snowing to get to Coeur d'Alene, and then Craig Johnson was there in the province meeting. Just to digress a little bit, our chapter in British Vancouver. You know, we made a big deal about we're now an international fraternity, and Bill Fitzpatrick wanted to get that chapter going, and I never will forget, we chartered it just about the time I came in as Grand Regent. And I looked at that and I kept saying, man, I don't know why we started this chapter up here. There was no other professional fraternity there. They had like 500 students. And the first time when they chartered it, then I came in as Grand Regent, I got looking, every one of these charter members are gone. And they didn't have anybody. And then they have a rush and they get like 4 people. I'm saying, they don't even have any competition to get 4 people. It was an old Elks club or something that they converted over to it. And we initiated the dean and even initiated him separately from the beginning in his office. Mm-hmm. But I'm saying, man, there's just not enough interest. But eventually Craig Johnson, to his credit, I mean, he got after it and it may really be thriving now. But and going up there with Fassett, I enjoyed it. Bill Fassett later was dean at, I guess, at Washington State. Had a good personality. He and there was another guy, Ed Krupski. He was the teaching assistant for Lewis Nobles that taught me calculations here. Bob was a graduate student under Lewis Nobles. The guy was a renowned pharmacy guy. And later he was the president of Mississippi College. But anyway, Bob was his instructor in the lab. And when we went out to Scottsdale in '79, and I was going to become the Grand Regent at the end of that convention, I had no idea we were going to make any new change. I didn't have one clue in his mind. I never even thought about it. And like I was telling you, I really probably not even have that little bit in there that I talked about that money bit. But what happened is, that was like in August. When I got back here around October, November, Bill Fitzpatrick was telling me, well, fraternity owes me some money for me doing these chapter visitations. And Larry Slater, we owed him some money. And I get this call, this printer for the mask in California. Turned out we owed that guy almost $10,000. We owed him a whole year. And I'm thinking, you know, why did he keep publishing it and we wasn't paying him? And Norman Kobayashi was the editor, and he was really concerned about it because he wasn't the one that could write the check, but he was the one that was the editor. Mm-hmm. And of course he hadn't gotten his honorarium either. And I finally, you know, I was looking at our financial statement, and we were on an accrual system of finances. But what we were doing was we were not listing the liabilities. The liabilities was listed as zero. Well, it wasn't zero. And then here was the income. And I talked to Diane Armitage, that was the secretary in the office one time. Never will forget. She talked to me on the phone. I'd say, well, we got to get this paid. And I said, you know, it looks to me like, Diane, we're $10,000 in the hole. And I never will forget. She says, well, Dewey said, I hate to tell you, said, it's worse than that. And I realized that, you know, it wasn't that we were absconding the money. We were just, it cost more. The rent there. And I got those folks paid back. I remember sending Bill Fitzpatrick a check, this whole amount, and I realized, I said, well, I really need to pay this bill. I called Bill and said, Bill, I said, how about me just paying you half of that and get me that, and I'll get it. He said, well, do it. He said, I went to the racetrack this weekend, and I spent that, gambled it at the racetrack. But, and then Kobayashi, that's one reason he really wanted to get out as editor, because that was kind of under, and he's a really nice guy. We're working with a pharmaceutical company, and he kind of wanted to get out. And of course, advertised the position, and I don't remember who else. There was about 3 or 4 people for each of those offices put in their name. Frank Fascione put his name in for the executive director. And I told Frank, well, I wasn't sure, you know, I knew that I kind of job, but he couldn't get any estimate of how much it was going to cost to have an office. And here it was in Oklahoma. Some people to this day probably figure I had it planned from the beginning, but it never crossed my mind about Bob McGarren doing that. But he had gone to the convention with the idea that he might apply for executive director because Don Floridio was running for an office. And you can't be an executive committee member and be executive director. Right. So Bob really thought that, well, he's going to drop being executive director because he knew it. Well, at the convention he didn't, and when he didn't, it was just gone. And we got back home, and I got figuring out on those bills, and that's why I realized we weren't paying our bills. And Bill Fitzpatrick, he owned the store, and he did this and that. I told Bill, I said, Bill, I said, if your business like you run this fraternity, I said, this place would be broke. He didn't keep up. Like he'd say, well, I did all this on my own, but he wanted to get paid. I mean, he just submitted a voucher to pay it. So, I mean, eventually we got him paid. Larry Slater, Don didn't like Larry much. And some people didn't like him, but others worshiped him. And Providence ate up there. They thought he was God. And he had his ways, but he came and he interacted with them. He was a little bit like Leonard Nager in interacting with so many people. Leonard, he would come to a meeting, and he'd have like 3 or 4 suitcases, and they were all empty, no clothes, you know. And then he would drink beer from the time that he got up in the morning to the night, and he would open the cans, not on the snout, but he'd puncture the other end, and then so he had a can that's set up. He put all them beer cans in his suitcase and take them back home with him. Barbara tells me, says, Leonard said he was a perennial drunk. I said, but you know, it didn't show. And then he'd do all these C programs, never charged fraternity anything. And the same way when it's like having that reception at the Gamma Pi house, man, it was so different from having one of these fancy hotels you have it in now. But Gamma Pi, I would get calls when I was at Grand Regent. I'd get a call. They have it's a private school, so they have a president and a dean of students and something else. These 3 positions. And they were all Kappa Psi brothers. Robbie, that long time, they have a president, a dean, and something. Anyway, one of them would call me one week, and 2 or 3 weeks, another would call me and say, well, Dewey said, we got to do something about this. Said, we're violating the fire code. Or they'd call me and say, well, Dewey said, you know, said, we got this old people's home next door to it, and said, they raising too much cane up here. Of course, when I talked to Lenny, and I see Lenny doing it, they'd pet those folks over there so much that I don't know whether they loved them or what. I don't know why the dean was getting upset on that. But they'd call me, and there's Barnes and Robbie and somebody. Bob McGarren actually was on their faculty at one time there. But then I looked at it and I said, you know, they are initiated as freshmen. Mm-hmm. And now it's 7 years. They get them in freshman year, you got them there 7 years. And in the city, and they're doing a rotation, they're all there. And it's their whole social life, not just their professional life. Here, like I told you, I'm in Kappa Psi from the professional part I was interested in. Now, we had a social, but I was in Sigma Nu fraternity. I was getting a social. Mm-hmm. But with them, it's their entire life. And then the other thing I realized is when they graduated, there was more financial support to national and the collegiate chapter from Gamma Nu than anybody in the country, or Gamma Pi. And the reason was because they had so many pleasant memories, it just carries right on. Mm-hmm. You know, when the women, I gotta quit so you can go, but when the women came in to the fraternity, the problem you had in fundraising is that up until then, you know, women, the husband worked and the woman was at home. Mm-hmm. So they have that mentality, even though when they went through pharmacy school, that they don't have the freedom with the money like the man did. Now today, I'm sure it's totally changed. But because of that, you weren't getting much financial commitment from the women into the fraternity. But we never had a dues structure. I remember at work, I learned some stuff in raising money, because I'm no fundraiser. I don't like to ask people for money. I got to give you this back. I don't want to ask people for money.